In this second tutorial, we will talk about frequency modulation, the oscillator, and how to generate random data sounds with this. So please open up the second example from the menu. It's called 2 generative data sounds. And arrange it to your likings. Turn that volume a little bit down so that you can hear me better. Here's again the volume adjustment knob on the right. So these are 2 oscillators that this one is frequency modulating the second oscillator here, which generates these complex and rich and organic sounding FM sounds. In the spectrum, you can see that it's jumping around because of the chaos modulation here, but it's also having a quite complex spectrum of overtones that are being generated with the frequency modulation. I turn the speed a little bit down here so that we can see more clearly how diverse these sounds are. And then in the oscilloscope, you can have an impression here as well how interestingly they are bent. So what is going on there? In order to understand this, turn down this oscillator here, and let's let this run. We have to talk about the oscillator module in more detail, which is a very, very central and important module of any modular environment. Okay, so I unplug this here, bring this oscillator out and scale it up a bit that you can see it better. So the most prominent features here are the 2 dials. The red one is the pitch dial. So if I turn this up, frequency goes up, and more frequency means more repetitions of the wave shape in less time. So it's being squeezed together, more repetitions in less time. So in the oscilloscope, the X is the time. In the OSC oscilloscope mode, the X is the time, where this is the amplitude. And if I go lower, then it's being stretched. And the reason why we can see this so nicely here, being so aligned, so statically aligned here, is because the trigger on rise button is pressed. It has been already pressed in the beginning when you loaded the patch. It's saved within the patch. If I turn this off, then this is not aligned to the right anymore, so it's more hard to see the actual wave shape. So let's turn this on again. And as a note, when you press the trigger button, you can also just tap these buttons. So you can go inside them and click, but it's easier to press in the beginning and tap them like so, and you can quickly tap many and you're just more fast. Okay, so this is the tracking and the speed of the oscillation. If we now go to the FFT perspective, then you can see then that this wave, the sine wave here, that this wave shape is only one frequency, so it's only one spike. If I go up, then this spike moves up. It gets thinner because the resolution here, it's increasing of the FFT spectrum here. It has more detail here than here. That's always the case with the fast Fourier transformation, the FFT. And if you go lower, it gets broader, but it's still just one sine wave. Okay, and now to the other wave shapes here. If I go to square, this is more loud, it has a lot of overtones, and it's a square wave, as you can see here. Sawtooth, again, if I pitch it down or up, the repetitions per time change, and there's a triangle wave. And these, in the spectrum perspective, they have a clear repetition pattern for their overtones. So these overtones, they get quieter the higher they go, but they have a certain step width, basically, which is defined within the wave shape. So a square wave has different overtones than a sawtooth here. that jump like this, and the triangle. And the sine wave doesn't have any. So basically, the square wave has very harsh ones, very loud ones, but it's missing some in between. Without going into further detail, here they are filled in, and the triangle has the least and is the most quiet. Okay, then there are 5 modulation inputs. So there is a pulse width modulation on the bottom, a synchronization input, 2 FM inputs, 1 exponentially tracking, and 1 which is linear through 0, and an amplitude modulation for AM amplitude modulation and ring modulation RM. Maybe let's have a quick look at the PWM here. You have to dial in the square wave for this and bring up, for instance, here from the menu, the DC generator, which is simply generating a number between -1 and 1. So if I maybe... I'm sorry for this. I unplugged it and then this attenuator was not working anymore. Was not in the patch line anymore. So I duplicate maybe the scope like this. So it's being triggered. Okay, so this is generating ranges between 1. This is 1, 0. That's the default setting. And then -1. If you do this, please mute the scope, because otherwise you have these strange sounds and the master overload message, because it's being fed into the audio master bus, but like that you can't hear it anymore, just see it. And deactivate the trigger on rise, because there is no really trigger going on, so otherwise there would be no update. Okay. So, and if I use this now as a modulation for this oscillator here in the PWM input. So let's switch to the oscillator perspective, and now if I turn this up, or maybe like the pitch up a bit. So this is the width of the pulse width, and I can adjust how long it is supposed to go, up to the point where it's actually fading away. And in the spectrum there is this notching going on here, changes the spectrum quite a lot, and yeah, that's actually a quite popular sound back in the 80s. Modulation like going between short and longer pulse widths. The PWM sound, as it was popular in the 80s, yeah. Okay, and of course you could also do this with another oscillator, switch it to triangle maybe, go into the low frequency mode, plug it in there. And then this is being automated, the movement that I just did. So the oscillator has all the features also in the low frequency mode, and just to let you know, and but it's several octaves slower, so several degrees of orders of magnitude slower. Okay, then let's look into the frequency modulation, because that's mostly what this tutorial will be about in the end. So there are 2 pitch inputs, frequency modulation inputs. Pitch 1 is using exponential FM with the volt per octave scheme, which is known as mostly from Eurorack. So basically, this tracks exponentially. If I reset this to 0 here, now 0 is coming in, no change. And if I go up to 1, then this tracks many octaves. Because it's exponential, it goes very far and then also very low to, now basically it's a low frequency oscillator. Can go very high and very low. It behaves exactly the same like this dial now, just that this dial here doesn't have as much range. So this does not exactly go into the low frequency domain so much. And if I add this even more, then I can go crazy low. So it's unlike, because it's a digital oscillator, it basically it's arbitrary, the frequencies that you dial in, while in analog circuitries there are limits where the oscillation would not take place anymore. So let's reset this with the reset buttons here, B and Y. Okay, and so the difference here with the pitch 2 is it's a linear through zero, the TC, linear through zero frequency modulation input. And the difference here is it's tracking hertz per volt. Here the labeling is should be the other way around. It's hertz per volt, and that means it's a linear tracking. It's not based on octaves. Octaves are an exponential scheme. One octave is doubling. Each octave means a doubling of the frequency. And this is, if I go up, that means that it doesn't go up as much, simply because it's linear. It cannot go up as much. As you know, linear growth is not as fast as exponential growth. And if I go lower, then something interesting happens, and that's the through zero part. I go very low, and then it wraps around. It comes up again. The oscillator now is basically running backwards, generating sound again. It just doesn't just go like halves the frequency more and more, like with the exponential. It's always a halving then when you go down and a doubling. But here it's actually going through the zero, wraps it around, and comes again. Oscillator runs backwards and generates the same sine waves. Okay, and so what is this being used for? So the exponential FM is very good for very harsh metallic modulations, and a keyboard can be connected to this input. So for instance, if I take this keyboard here and the pitch out of the keyboard, and I can play it chromatically, like with the normal 12 tone pattern scheme. That wouldn't work at all if I go in here, it's just off. Okay, so this can be used for tone playing and for very harsh exponential modulations. Whereas the linear through zero mode cannot be used for tone playing, but produces more nicely placed overtones. So it's also musically interesting for many applications, but it cannot be played chromatically. Okay, so, and now if we put a modulation source in here to the exponential FM, I'm in an LFO thing here. If I put it up, the speed. So it's a vibrato now, but like a theremin. Low amplitude here means not so extreme modulation. So the linear TC in this range sounds the same, pretty much. Doesn't make a big difference here. But the difference comes in when I switch to audio rate, to VCO, higher frequency range. I reset both speeds so that they are the same frequency, with both frequencies. And now with the exponential FM here, when I dial this in, it's very extreme. It's also, it can go very high, further than the sampling of the OpenSoundLab audio code currently permits. So that's why it's wrapping around so heavily on this side. But this is a typical exponential FM sound. And as you can see, if you move up the speed here, the bass tone, this here, it's being shifted upwards. And this is not ideal in musical contexts because it changes the bass note of your oscillation. Whereas if I use the linear through zero FM input here, and I dial this in, then you can see that the bass note, it stands still. It's adding overtones, but there is no shift in the basic character, which makes it much more applicable for FM sounds which are played chromatically. And so this is something which we will not go further into now for like generating musical FM sounds. We're gonna work with generating random tones now. But just to let you know, this is the biggest difference between exponential and linear through zero FM. Right. Okay. And so we modulated the frequency with a static signal, with a DC signal, with a keyboard, and now with an LFO and in a VCO. And now we have this little oscillator here. Oops, very loud. Excuse me. And yeah, this is random numbers. So computer sounds from the 60s, sci-fi movies always had to sound like this. So basically you jump around in the random numbers. Mute this and turn off the triggering. So random numbers are jumping around and set the tones in quite big jumps here for this oscillator. And yeah, if you add this now to the exponential FM on this modulator here, on this oscillator here, then you get, turn up the speed dial a little bit, then you get these complicated, organic, quite diversely changing overtone patterns. Right, and if you patch this into the linear through zero FM input here, it also sounds quite richly, and because the two oscillators are not synced with each other. So usually with linear through zero applications, you would have the modulator in an integer division relationship to each other. So 1 octave or 2 octaves higher, or based on certain musical steps and not just randomly. Right. And if you increase the speed here, it begins to sound like a modem, a dial-up modem from the 90s. So if you're old enough to know these, basically they did the same thing, a similar thing, I must say. So they were encoding digital data, the bits, into a sine wave carrier through modulating it with, for instance, frequency modulation, also other modulation patterns. And this is quite similar to dial-up modems for this reason. Okay, that's it for tutorial number 2.